Welcome to WCS Money Tutorials. Today's topic is why Bitcoin does not make good legal tender. El Salvador is the first country to make Bitcoin legal tender. They enacted legislation legalizing the following. Bitcoin can be used to pay taxes, and businesses with the appropriate technology must accept it as payment. El Salvador is using Zap Strike software for transactions by leveraging Bitcoin's Lightning Network instead of using the blockchain directly. The Lightning Network is both cheaper and faster. Using the software requires only an email address and a phone. El Salvador has almost 150 cell phone subscriptions for every 100 inhabitants, so the technology to use Bitcoin is pervasive. Bitcoin can be purchased with a debit card or a bank account. The government is creating a $150 million fund so people can exchange Bitcoin for US dollars, otherwise known as USD, at any time. Legal tender is the currency or other form of payment that must be legally accepted as payment for debts or goods and services. Legal tender is usually fiat currency that has value because the issuing government says so. However, El Salvador enacted legislation in 2021 to make it the first country to make Bitcoin legal tender. El Salvador is a country of Central America with a population of about 6.5 million people. It is about the same size as New Jersey. El Salvador does not issue its own currency. Instead, it has used the US dollar since 2001. Much of its income comes from remittances from abroad, especially from the United States, which is a major source of US dollars for its economy. Much of the immigration to the United States may be so that the immigrants can send money home to their relatives so that they can survive. El Salvador adopted dollarization to increase foreign investment, but the lack of rule of law and the predominance of criminal gangs caused foreign investment to drop. One reason given for adopting Bitcoin as legal tender is that 70% of the people in El Salvador do not have a bank account. However, this has nothing to do with fiat currency. Most likely it is due to the corrupt government making institutions under its influence untrustworthy. Bitcoin has problems as a national currency. Countries that issue their own currency have several good reasons never to adopt Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency as legal tender. Governments earn no seigniorage, which is the profit made by creating money, so it would have to collect that as additional taxes. For instance, the United States of America earns hundreds of billions of dollars annually from seigniorage, money that would otherwise have to be collected as taxes. Governments would lack effective monetary tools to stimulate or throttle the economy as needed. For instance, the economy during and after the COVID-19 pandemic would have been far worse if the central banks were not able to increase the money supply to stimulate their economies. These disadvantages are great enough that no country issuing its own currency would ever approve of a currency it had no control over. However, since El Salvador does not issue its own currency, these disadvantages do not apply. However, Bitcoin does have other disadvantages. Blockchain operators must be paid fees to record transactions, and often these fees are a high percentage of the transaction value. The Bitcoin blockchain can only process about 7 transactions per second, and this limit applies to all worldwide transactions, not just to transactions within El Salvador. These disadvantages can be minimized using improved technology. This is why El Salvador will be using the Lightning Network instead of the blockchain directly, because it will be cheaper and faster. However, Bitcoin has a huge disadvantage that will not be solved by technology: volatility. A primary problem Bitcoin was trying to solve was to develop a trustworthy financial system that did not rely on a third party, such as the government. But without a third party, how do you control the supply of money? Bitcoin solved this problem by fixing the supply to a maximum of about 21 million Bitcoins. These Bitcoins are recreated by a mining procedure of solving cryptographic puzzles that yields fewer and fewer Bitcoins per unit of time. It is estimated that all 21 million Bitcoins will have been created by the year 2140. In 2021, there were almost 19 million Bitcoins, which means that only slightly more than 2 million Bitcoins will be issued in the next 119 years. This means that for all practical purposes, the supply of Bitcoin is fixed. As economists like to say, the supply of Bitcoin is almost perfectly inelastic. Prices change more as the inelasticity of supply increases. Diagram 2 shows what happens when the supply is elastic. When demand increases from D1 to D2, then the quantity increases from Q1 to Q2. This increase in supply mitigates the increase in price, so the price only increases by a little. By contrast, with an inelastic supply, when demand increases, then the quantity increases by only a little, causing a larger increase in prices. You can see this if the elasticity is perfect or perfectly inelastic. With perfectly elastic supply, when demand increases from D1 to D2, then the quantity increases without changing the price at all. But with a perfectly inelastic supply, when demand increases from D1 to D2, then the quantity doesn't change at all, so the price increases by the maximum amount than would otherwise be the case if suppliers could increase the quantity with increased demand. The volatility of Bitcoin can easily be seen in this chart. During this recent 3-month period, Bitcoin has ranged widely in price, going from a high of $63,503 to a low of $33,473, a price drop of almost 50% in less than 2 months. Changing the money supply to meet demand is the only way to keep a currency stable. The demand for money varies with the economy and with the population. The value of fiat currency is held steady by the central banks because they can increase or decrease the money supply as needed. Changing the money supply is the only way to keep the value of the currency stable. The supply of Bitcoin is fixed because it was designed that way. But a fixed supply means that Bitcoin will always be volatile, as has well been demonstrated by its history. Bitcoin was designed to prevent government manipulation. And it is true that some governments do increase the money supply to benefit themselves, as shown by the hyperinflation that commonly occurs in corrupt countries. This is why central banks, such as the Federal Reserve in the United States, have some political independence to allow them to adjust the money supply to benefit the economy rather than the whims of politicians. That central banks work is attested by the low, predictable inflation of major economies. This low, steady inflation allows people, businesses, and governments to plan their future, which would be extremely difficult with a currency that varies in value. And even though this inflation is low, it generates significant seigniorage for economies. This is some of the text of the Bitcoin law. As they say, the devil is in the details. This is what the law says. The highlighting is mine. The exchange rate will be established by the market. Prices may be expressed in Bitcoin. And there are no capital gains taxes on Bitcoin exchanges. Many investors think this is great. However, this was probably necessary to make Bitcoin more usable as money. Otherwise, people would incur capital gains taxes frequently when exchanging Bitcoins for dollars, which would require keeping records for each exchange. Note also that only exchanges of Bitcoin would not be subject to a capital gains tax, but such taxes will still apply to the sale of other assets. Taxes may also be paid in Bitcoin, but there are also problems with this, as I will explain later. People constantly ask, what is the price of Bitcoin? What they are asking is how many US dollars or other fiat currency can be exchanged for 1 Bitcoin. The major function of money is to serve as a unit of account, meaning that the value of any good or service can be measured by its price. But this only works if the value of the currency itself is stable. That people are constantly looking up the price of Bitcoin provides ample evidence that it cannot serve as a unit of account. And although the law allows it, businesses will not price their goods and services in Bitcoin since the price of Bitcoin changes significantly every day. Naturally, businesses will not want to be constantly changing prices. And since Bitcoin cannot serve as a unit of account, it also means that it cannot be used in accounting. How can you determine profit or loss when the value of your revenue and liabilities in terms of Bitcoin will change every single day? This is probably why the law requires that businesses continue to use USD for accounting. Because USD is still going to be used for accounting, businesses will naturally want to convert their Bitcoin to USD as quickly as possible. Otherwise, there will be significant exchange risk when taxes become due. Some may argue that El Salvador allows businesses to pay in Bitcoin, so where is the exchange risk? There will still be exchange risk even if converting to USD is unnecessary, because what businesses need to exchange is Bitcoin for their tax liability. But since tax liability will be calculated using USD, it will still matter what the value of Bitcoin is when the taxes are due, even if the tax liability is paid entirely with Bitcoins. If the government receives Bitcoin, then it too will have exchange risk. When Bitcoin declines in value, then the government will not have enough to pay its suppliers and employees. Bitcoin may also hurt the economy. If people expect the value of Bitcoin to increase, then they will not spend it, which will hurt the economy. Business owners can only make money if people are buying. If they are not buying, businesses will not make money, which will force them to lay off people, so the people will not have money either. Naturally, both the economy and the people will suffer. Let's summarize the properties of money that allow it to function as money. Money has three properties that make it desirable: as a means of payment, a unit of account, and as a store of value. However, these properties are desirable and effective only if the value of the currency is stable. While all currencies experience some inflation, this inflation is low and predictable. Bitcoin is not an efficient means of payment since its current value must be ascertained whenever a transaction occurs. The relationship between the value of labor or capital and the goods and services that value can buy will fluctuate. For instance, if you earn $1,000 in Bitcoin, then the value of that Bitcoin in terms of the goods and services that it can buy may be dramatically different by the time you spend it. It cannot serve effectively as a unit of account because the prices of goods and services would fluctuate continually, so there is no way to determine what the price will be until it is paid. It cannot serve as a store of value because it could decline in value at any time. Eventually, it may decline to its intrinsic value, zero, because no one can know what the value of Bitcoin will be, especially if it is years in the future. Considerable risk would be incurred by holding it, especially if it is for retirement. Declaring Bitcoin as legal tender will not make it so. Because of the many problems using Bitcoin as money, the United States dollar will continue to be the de facto legal tender in El Salvador. These same problems would afflict any country adopting Bitcoin as legal tender. And since most governments issue their own currency, they are certainly not going to give up the seigniorage and the monetary tools that the issuance of its own currency allows. Thus, Bitcoin will never serve as a major currency. People in corrupt countries and criminals and other people who want to hide their transactions may use it, but Bitcoin does not have the desirable characteristics of money. What is most likely to happen, due to the significant exchange risk of holding Bitcoin, is that both people and businesses who receive Bitcoin will immediately convert it to USD. Some may keep it hoping that the value will increase, but they will not use it as legal tender. Thank you very much for your time. If you liked my video, please subscribe. I would appreciate any suggestions, so please leave them in the comments below. Also, check out my website at thismatter.com and my books at williamspalding.com. Thank you.